Okay. Well, hello, friends. And it's been a while since I've been able to work with you on the externalization of the hierarchy. And I think it's been about 1 year and 2 months. And much has happened since that time. We're in the middle of a coronavirus outbreak, which explains perhaps the medieval look that I have at the moment. And I'd just like to continue. We reached this point where we are dealing with the cycle of conferences. We have done 44 programs, which I think are on Makara, makara.us. And now we will proceed. Simultaneously, I am working on a compilation on the fourth initiation, and also on the book Telepathy and the Etheric Vehicle. So this section begins on page 445, it looks like. Let's see. Somewhere here. Well, we'll find out where it begins. Yep, 445. So this is called the cycle of conferences. Okay, I'm sharing, and I hope I'm recording to the cloud. That would be very nice if everything was working. So this is from March 1945, a big jump from May 1944. Already interiorly, that always comes first, the war had been won following the defeat of the Germans at Stalingrad and the capture of a huge number of soldiers, I think, in their 6th Army. They were surrounded by the General Zhukov, the Russians, and they could not escape. From there, it was just a question of working things out on the physical plane. But the war had been won, the Tibetan tells us. So let's see, mostly I'll be, kind of talking about this and maybe not writing too much. Yeah, that's the way it's going to be. And the picture may be a little small, at least at the moment that I'm recording it. It is adequate size, but I'm new to this particular format, and there are other things that have to be learned. The 3 months of March, April, and May in this year 1945, mark a moment in time of major significance in our planetary history. Notice the whole history of the planet, you know. Man arrived from the moon chain in Atlantean days, but earlier than that, in Lemuria, there was an individualization of animal man 21 million years ago, approximately. He gives some kind of figure, I think, in esoteric astrology, and whether you treat that as symbolic or actual will depend. I think there's a lot of actuality in it, but the individualization process took time. It didn't occur overnight. And the signs Leo and Gemini, and I think Sagittarius were involved, and also Cancer for the first incarnation of the newly human types. Probably we wouldn't recognize them as very human, but they were probably massive creatures. And some of us were there, and some of us came from an earlier location, like the moon chain, or even from the previous solar system, the major one, the previous major solar system. Now, so DK says, I refer to the Easter full moon, celebrated in that year, on March 28th, the Wesak full moon, which falls this year on April 27th. Notice he's using tropical indicators and not sidereal indicators, dates. April 27th is definitely in tropical Taurus and not in sidereal Taurus. Really, what's happening is that sidereal astrology is used by some, but I think it applies more to the planetary logos as a whole once a certain level of evolution is reached. Maybe it applies to Chohans particularly, who are, you know, members of the planetary kingdom. So Wesak, April 27th, and the full moon of June, Christ's unique occasion, as it has been called, which falls on May 26th. Again, that's tropical Gemini, based upon the position of the vernal equinox. Not against a background of stars necessarily, but starting from 0 degrees of Aries as measured in the tropical zodiac and not the sidereal zodiac. He does tell us that when we say the sun is in Aries, let's say tropically, it is not an exoteric fact, but it is an esoteric truth, an esoteric truth. And that's just the opposite of what so many astrologers may think. So anyway, Christ's unique occasion, as it has been called, May 26th. From the standpoint of both the hierarchy and humanity, the events during these few weeks of spiritual and mundane import focused through these 3 spiritual festival moons of Aries, Taurus, and Gemini will be stupendous in their effect. What is done during this time by the members of the spiritual hierarchy of our planet who face a major test of their hierarchical power, I suppose, in orientation to Shambhala, not a test of their love. Hierarchical power is the issue for them, so definitely Shambhala is involved with their task and not a test of their love. So during that time, the members of the spiritual hierarchy of our planet are facing this, and what is accomplished by the disciples working in the world at this time and also by the new group of world servers, I would say most of whom are disciples, but unconscious of that fact, the majority, or very few are students of occultism or esotericism, can and will determine the destiny of man for centuries to come. We have to know what are the pivotal moments and know when we are passing through them. So I suppose, I gather, that whatever they did at that time was successful. Even those who have no knowledge of occult matters or of human fate or of the effective enterprise of free will, esoterically understood, stand today with bated breath, I would say, at a point of tension, waiting to see what will happen and towards which goal or goals human thinking and planning will be directed. So some success came there, I suspect. There still is the danger of the path of materialism, which did continue for many, but I think enough saw a different and brighter future that humanity basically was reoriented. Now, whether we're like the man who swept his house clean of a number of devils, then went away and ignored it, and came back and found many more devils had inhabited his house, whether we're like that now is a problematic issue. There is another onslaught taking place from the Black Lodge, from the Lords of Form, from the forces of obstruction. And they are intent, and as DK says, warring militantly against aspirants and especially against disciples, and I suppose even more against the initiates and the higher initiates. I'm seeming to remember something from Master Moria, where he says, oh, you bother yourself over a few devils, while the daggers of Satan are aimed at our backs. Meaning that the big fight with the Black Lodge is taking place in the higher ranks of hierarchy and in Shambhala. The masses of mankind everywhere have only one desire: tranquility. I use not the word peace. It's a different thing, isn't it? Much more demanding concept, because it has such a misleading connotation. Many people think that peace is just quiet and tranquility, and the allowance for certain bad tendencies to continue as long as they don't make too much noise and are not too obvious. Thinking men and women in every country stand with massed intent, determined, if possible, to take those steps which will ensure peace on earth through the expression of goodwill. Note that phrasing. It is love in action, or goodwill, leading to sharing and a kind of cleanliness which will guarantee the peace, a real peace. It's not something you can impose, it grows out of the quality of humanity at a particular time, and especially the quality of disciples and initiates, the educative quality of disciples and initiates. The working disciples throughout the world are struggling with every means at their disposal to spread the gospel of sacrifice, to make sacred and to give up the lesser for the greater, and to detach from limitation. They're spreading the gospel of sacrifice, because only upon sacrifice can world stability be safely founded. And here's the summary of it: the sacrifice of selfishness. So it's a form of enhanced perception, a larger type of perception which allows one the type of action which is not simply egotistical. We have so many leaders today who are simply that. They are lower egos in terms of their self-realization. They are not souls. As a matter of fact, to become a soul, a real soul, and be called a soul, it means you've taken the fourth initiation. The sacrifice of selfishness. I suppose this is something which should be sort of highlighted, don't you think? Because it's operative in all of our lives. First of all, we have to realize what it is, and it's a Martian quality largely, although it is possible to be selfish on every planet or in relation to every planet and sign. But the defeat of selfishness, a part of it, comes at the second initiation. Between the first and second, you kind of learn how to do it. And Venus, Jupiter, and Neptune, in a way, defeat Mars at the second initiation. And then another defeat of Mars comes at the third initiation, when Vulcan, which is veiled by the moon, the spiritual will, defeats desire in the ordinary sense. In those words is summed up the demand being made on those whose responsibility it is to determine policies, national and international, executives, legislators, the executive branch of government, the judiciary. I'm speaking of the divisions in the United States largely, but other countries have their counterparts. And to take those steps which will establish right human relations. It seems to be the theme of Shambhala at this time, right human relations, moving from the conflict side of the fourth ray, which is ever ready to engage in frictional relationship, to the harmonious aspect, the higher aspect of the fourth ray, humanity's ray. So right human relations are to be established. Have they been established? Has the entire opportunity been seized? No, it has not. And everywhere we look, there are outstanding examples of wrong human relations, but some gain in understanding has come. There was a great consciousness movement starting from, I think, the assumption by the Christ of the vestures of the Buddha in 1966, would it be? 1 year after the era of the Forerunner began in 65. And now we're coming to the end of that 60-year period in which humanity is supposed to be reoriented, and the voice crying in the wilderness, the group John the Baptist, the members of the new group of world servers have to be successful, and they have to help elevate humanity through helping to restore the plan, Aries, bring forward enlightenment, Taurus, and reconstruct, Gemini. The hierarchy stands. Each one of us must take our stand in spiritual being as well, whatever that means to us, no longer watching and waiting, but acting today with impelling wisdom. You know, it propels, it impels, it influences. It's not wisdom, it is wisdom which acts with impelling action and fixed decision in order to strengthen the hands of their workers in every field of human activity, political, educational, religious. The political workers raise 1, 6, and 7. Educational workers raise 2, 3, and 5. Religious workers raise 2 and 6. So hierarchy is busy strengthening the hands of their workers in every area so that they may take right action and correctly influence human thinking. Notice it starts with thinking. We're not compelling anybody by force. You know, the old saying, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. You can't shove their head under the water or in the water. You just have to set up circumstances which will allow an action coming from those who should benefit from the circumstances you have staged. A powerful first ray activity, the activity of will or purpose, is swinging into action. Notice that there he equates will with purpose, but I've often felt that will is the pure energy of the first ray, and purpose combines will with pattern and brings in a second ray modification. The activity of will or purpose is swinging into action. The Christ, as the leader of the forces of light, has empowered the ashrams of the masters upon the first ray of power. It's a plural ashrams, isn't it? I mean, sometimes we're told that only really there's one major ashram on the first ray and not subdivided into its subsidiaries, but there we have it. It looks like more than one is active, and the Christ is as the head of the hierarchy, and it also seems the heart of the hierarchy has empowered these masters to strengthen the hands of all disciples in the field of government and of political arrangement in every nation. I think the seventh ray is included there, which is a more formal reflection of the first ray and with more detailed working out of relationships. So that's one thing that the Christ has empowered them to do. To enlighten, there we come with the second ray, if possible, the various national legislators by whatever means they may be needed, and it's not always possible. We have some very benighted legislatures. And speaking for the United States, about which I maybe know more, it seems to be heading downhill. But then the withering of the law is in process, and it's unavoidable at the end of the age. By whatever means may be necessary, so that the potency of their words, the wisdom of their planning, ray 3, ray 7, and the breadth of their thinking, ray 3, may prove so effective that the cycle of conferences and of councils, now being indicated by the statesmen of the world, may be under the direct guidance, again if possible, of those in the council chamber who know what is the will of God. Well, we're talking about at least Chohans. And we're talking about, the influence not only of hierarchy, but maybe to some extent of Shambhala in the General Assembly of the United Nations, which is considered, less tainted than the very political and power-hungry members of the Security Council, the bigger nations and occasionally some others invited in on a temporary basis. The selfishness of the little minds in the various legislatures of the world must in some way be offset. And if you've been following, televised versions of debates where accusations along partisan lines are flying fast and furious, you know that what he's saying is correct. And remember, the civil rights movement in the United States had not yet taken place. There was a lot of resistance against that, and it had to be overcome. So there are little minds in the legislatures of the world, and they certainly don't help the required fate of their nation, of their country, advance. So that is the problem, he says. The selfishness. Well, people want to keep their job, and a certain type of people have elected them, and it is representative government. And so you have people voting for the part rather than the whole. Just a moment here. I wonder if you can grasp the significance page 447, of this happening. Down the ages, individual statesmen, it's quite a difference between a statesman and a politician, is there not? Individual statesmen and rulers from time to time have been responsive to the influence of that spiritually supreme council. He did talk about the disciples of Shambhala, and he included some people of questionable intent. He certainly would include Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, but he also included, I think, Stalin and Franco, and I think he included Ataturk favorably. But even Hitler was included when the extent of his monstrous approach to humanity had not been fully unfolded. So he says the disciples of Shambhala are very poorly understood. Well, because they do bring destruction, and humanity has a second-ray bias, and even in this solar system, especially on this second-ray soul planet, we do have a bias towards the second ray and against the forceful first ray. So he wonders if we can grasp the significance of this happening, this linking up with Shambhala, for better or for worse. The Nazis basically forewent association with the love energy. And so they had a kind of an inverted Shambhala influence, simply based on will and cunning intelligence. Down the ages, some of the rulers have been responsive to the Supreme Council. It has been the responsiveness of the individual disciple who has worked alone and unaided, and who has faced or experienced defeat as often, if not oftener, than he has experienced victory. Well, we have to persist, even though our defeats are common and obvious, at least to ourselves. Today in the planning, now going forward in connection with the various international conferences, and you kind of think here that the United Nations as an idea was really shaping up. Today in the planning, now going forward in connection with the various international conferences and councils, of which you all know, the spiritual effort for the first time in human history is to bring all of them as functioning groups under the direct impact of the energy which motivates and actuates that place where the will of God is known and the purposes of divinity are defined and then projected. The higher two planes of the cosmic physical plane give us divinity. The planes of the spiritual triad give us spirituality. Sometimes the words are used specifically, and sometimes they are rather conflated. Well, disciples did see the end of the war coming, and they planned the United Nations long before it appeared. A continuation of the involvement of Master Serapis and the Master Jesus and a certain Colonel House, and then Woodrow Wilson and so forth, to bring forward the League of Nations. The United Nations, however, was brought forward by those who had learned a lesson from the disintegration of the League of Nations. So it still persists to this day, always with financial difficulty because of the selfishness of some of the donor nations who still think in terms of their own sovereignty and not in terms of the welfare of humanity in the world as a whole. He calls Shambhala a place. Well, yes, it's a point of tension, where the will of God is known and purposes, the purposes of deity or divinity, are defined and projected. And this means that each of the coming world conferences, and many lesser, of course, and there will necessarily be many of these world conferences, will have a greater and more extensive effect than would otherwise be the case because of hierarchical influence, projection of the divine into the process of formulation and sustenance of the new groups that hold these world conferences. It means, however, that the risks involved and the clash of minds will also be far greater. Interesting term, isn't it? Clash of minds. You know, we have the various political parties, and there we certainly witness the clash of minds. This is the point which you should bear in mind as you study and read reports of these various conferences. The hierarchy is largely behind them. The risks are greater. The stability in general is greater than in earlier times. And some kind of spiritual victory is, after all, expected from the hierarchical expenditure of energy and the recognition by the disciples of what has to be done as they labor under hierarchical impress. Yeah. So hierarchy helps, no question about it. Whoop. That's not it. That's an email address. And let's do it this way. Yeah. We can say that hierarchy is always helping. If only humanity would realize it. And I think the day is coming when you look at this is in the year 2020. And when you see the economic and health problems being compounded, and the various culture wars which are in process of repeating on a subtler level, hopefully, the civil wars of earlier times, you begin to wonder whether humanity can find its own way out of this. And the Tibetan predicted that really humanity could not without the help of the hierarchy, and there would be an invocation and subsequent evocation of hierarchy to assist, and their expert means of assistance would be recognized and respect for what they are and where they are, even if they are simply believed to be wise people and not members of the hierarchy, that all that would grow. Well, let us see. Right now, we see a lot of short-sightedness, an attempt to return to old and inadequate values because we are in denial and we hate to face the truth of a necessary transition. Okay. Forget not that divine energy, I guess that's of the monad and the higher planes, must make its impact upon human minds. Well, if it's divine, it's largely monadic, and some of the subplanes of Atman Buddhic plane, and logoic. Those in our cosmic physical plane are the sources of divine energy. Spiritual energy is another matter and can be resourced from lower levels. These minds are the only available instrument in their aggregated effect through which the will of God can express itself. You know, you might say this is requiring group expression. They are necessarily responsive to the stimulating and energizing results of that impact of divine energy. And this will evoke, cause an answer to come from, this will evoke results suited to the type of mind affected. So if you ask, you will receive. Response will be compatible with the quality and the intention of those minds. Where goodwill is present, those qualities will be strengthened and endowed with potency, unselfishness rather than selfishness, goodwill rather than hate in action and repulsion, and union instead of division, and the great heresy of separateness will start to be overcome. Where selfishness rules where isolationism and separativeness are present, and where there is the intention to gain individual and national ends instead of those international purposes which will profit all humanity, those qualities will equally gain in strength, because what's being evoked or invoked and then evoked is the members of the forces of obstruction. They too can be reached, and DK tells us that speculation about them is both futile, something like that, and dangerous. Okay, a little more, I think. Two momentous but preliminary conferences have already taken place, thus inaugurating this new cycle of group functioning. And here he deals with, really world groups. The League of Nations was an abortive effort, page 448, well-intentioned but relatively useless, as later happenings proved. We just were not in a position to exert any kind of power to ameliorate the forces which brought on the Second World War. One of these initial conferences was held at Yalta. There, three men constituting a basic triangle, met with goodwill to all and endeavored to lay the ground for the coming world happenings. Well, I guess he's even including Stalin in that way. Certainly from our perspective, goodwill was displayed, though cunning too, by Roosevelt and Churchill. Churchill was, in a way, the odd man out. The British had been destroyed, though they remained, and the nation was shattered and impoverished, and he correspondingly wielded less influence, though he was the first Westerner to really recognize the danger and to sound the alarm. So 3 men were involved in this. And, you know, they each had their own opinion of the others, and it wasn't always a gracious opinion. The faults were seen. Well, they were all first-rate types, you know. All of them disciples of Shambhala. The most brilliant, I think, was Churchill, as future works indicated. Maybe the one with the most heart was Roosevelt, and the one with the most cunning and will to preserve the power of his nation was Stalin. And they sort of divided up the world into spheres of influence, and certainly Stalin acted on this. I guess they all acted on it if they were in a position to do so. But the Russia of the time, the Soviet Union of the time, occupied thence many countries that did not appreciate their presence. And eventually the yoke was thrown off with the coming down of the Berlin Wall and with the ascent of Gorbachev, actually a disciple, though not well respected by all in Russia for various petty reasons, I think, because he was much more an internationalist than simply a nationalist. And so it became a Russian Federation rather than a Soviet Union, with greater degrees of autonomy in the modern age. So you look in that part of the country and you see that the peoples of those countries have their own government with much more autonomy now, and some still bow to Russia and others are more independent, but they are still related. All true movements conditioning long cycles in world affairs have at their center a triangle through which energy can flow and certain definite purposes be worked out. Well, I suppose, you know, at some point he talks about the president or the main ruler, and then the secretary of the interior and the secretary of the exterior, the more outreaching, internationally active individual. A triangle of that kind. And maybe by the quality of that triangle, we learn of the potential success or failure of the nation for any given period. Little is understood as yet Little is understood as yet anent the nature of the task to be done, or the type of men who work in first-rate groups and ashrams, and in whose hands the political destiny of man rests at any one time. Well, the first-rate type in this second-rate solar system, yes, they are not well understood and often resented. Sometimes, as the Tibetans said, they are justifiably resented because they have stepped in and disrupted civilizations and cultures, thrown the rhythm off, interfered, imposed, and he includes, when he talks about that, quite a number of strong conquerors. I can't remember all, but Akbar, even, who is now Master Morya, was included. So I guess, that's the impersonal way of looking at things that the hierarchy takes. They speak the truth, and the masters, recognizing their own faults when they were at an earlier degree, simply accept what is true and don't say, you criticized me and therefore I won't be your friend. There are some petty politicians who are that way, and the ones we're talking about love the truth, love the plan, and are willing to accept the criticism as they look back upon their own mistakes before they had become masters. And it's even possible for a master to make mistakes. Even a Chohan, even a planetary logos can make mistakes, and who knows how high it goes. The whole subject of discipleship has been distorted by theological definitions. Logic itself of a humankind is not going to show things as they really are. So distorted by theological definitions based upon sweetness of character, and yet the Tibetan says, or is he just translating, be sweet and kind and good, keep silence and the light will enter in, he says. But it's not a helpless kind of sweetness, ineffectual kind of sweetness. It's not that. It's more adopting the magnetic power of Venus, really. Anyway, discipleship has been characterized by distortions, by the insistence upon sweetness. I'm sure Ray 1 disciples would find that very difficult, which often works singularly for ineffectiveness. Think about that. I think Madame Blavatsky, with a great heart, was certainly not sweet. The long cycle of ecclesiastical rule has biased human thinking. This is during the age of Pisces, right? So that the nature of spiritual strength and effectiveness is interpreted in terms of religion and in the terminology of churchianity. I did not say of Christianity. He makes the distinction, and we carry that distinction through even today. Or in the phraseology of a marked pacifism or of a dominating religious temporal control. That's why Masonry, a tool of hierarchy, so often insists on the separation of church and state. which certain religio-political types today seek to reinstate. They want a state in which their religion, their churchianity, whatever, rules. And it's extremely dangerous. We've had that before in the Inquisitions. The long rule of the various churches is over. The age of Pisces is coming to an end. And if you're going to cultivate churchianity, the influence of Pisces is a good one in which to work. This should be grasped. Let me put that down. The long rule of the various churches is over, and people in the church, you know, they deeply resent that. They think the church should rule, and it has grown in power politically in a way. The voting blocs that support that kind of mixture of religion and politics, that voting bloc has strengthened, at least in the United States, which, as the Tibetan says, is heir to the Piscean sixth ray civilization. This should be grasped. They have done their work in the early stages, very good work, you know, orienting humanity towards the ideal. In the middle stages, unnecessary consolidating work, you know, the height and flowering of medieval civilization in the West, and maybe correspondences in the East. And in the modern stage, a crystallizing and reactionary work, meaning a freezing, a rigidity, which is anti-progressive. The word progressive is shown to be, or seems to be, anathema to such people who really want to hang on to the final revelation, as if a worm with its sensory knowledge of its environment on sidewalks and in the earth could ever speak of the finality of its consciousness. The rule of the churches is over, but not the precepts of Christianity or the example of the Christ. A keen distinction here. Let us really understand it. Christ brought something called Christianity, or at least it became that. And it's not a strictly formal matter. It has to do with moral quality and the quality of consciousness and the open, benevolent heart filled with love. The mind that, as it is in Christ, is supposed to characterize Christianity. It doesn't really, as we've often seen in so many instances, characterize churchianity. So the rule of the churches is over, but not the precepts of Christianity or the example of the Christ. Master Moria says, give yourself, as Thomas à Kempis did, to the imitation of the Christ and not to the worship of the Christ. He doesn't need your worship. He needs your imitation, that you do likewise. Well, anyway, he is, however, responsible for a newer, that is, the Christ is, a newer and more effective presentation of the coming world religion. And in the marvelous little book, The Reappearance of the Christ, we see the outlines of the religion, a new world religion that he will present. He is responsible for that newer and more effective presentation of the coming world religion, and for that the churches, often so reactionary and so frightened, should prepare. If they have enough illumination, and that's where the new group of world servers comes in, to recognize their need and his effort to meet that need. Well, friends, I'm doing this 1 hour at a time. It's been a while. And I really, using the new platform, I just don't know how it will turn out. We seem to be on page 448. And I'm just going to go back here to capture this. And we began on page 445. So not a lot of pages, but some amplification, which may be useful. We want to link things up, and if we do that, then we come closer to developing the ability to possess pure reason, the antechamber to the immediacy of intuition. It's no longer the 20th of March. It's a different time. It is the 15th of April. No, May. May. 1920. And program 46 is what we will deal with, beginning with page 448 and going to whatever page, maybe 3 or 4 pages at a time if I don't write too much and I digress too much. And I'm just going to, on a wing and a prayer, I'm going to say I'm going to do a bit more today. We got to get used to this again. The conference was demanding. Our first cyber conference. Successful, intimate, illuminative, I think, but a little bit tiring for some. So we'll carry on here next, and I'll try to keep these, well, I can't promise, but I'll try to keep them around an hour. So that will be it for the moment. Love and many blessings.